How is that working? No. Yeah. Thank you very much. That's so as the last speaker, I'm going to, I guess, take it upon myself first on behalf of all the speakers to thank you very much for turning 20 and inviting you to the party. I think this has been, I can say it confidently since I haven't spoken yet, has been a fantastic conference. I think I've not learned so much economics since first year of graduate school in such short period of time. Thank you very much to Maristella in particular for taking excellent care of us, and to, I guess, to all the speakers for great presentation. The second thing I need to do is to apologize. I am not Bill Easterly, and I'm not a very proper replacement in very many respects, but I'm going to do my best anyway. The third thing I want to do is to start by sharing the blame for whatever I'm going to do with Abhhijit, and then maybe a commercial break. Part of what I'm going to talk about today, or mostly what I'm going to talk about today, and to be for full disclosure, what Abhhijit talked about earlier, is in part coming out of a book that has his birthday today in Europe. It just released today, so we're very excited. That's Poor Economics, and that's an effort to put together a lot of what we know, some of it from our work, but a lot from other people's work, about various topics of development. And having done that, we kind of start being a little concerned whether it was kind of a big waste of time. Because when you're looking at sometimes we wonder whether what we do is micro, the irrelevant details, as opposed to macro, the big picture that was yesterday's session. A lot of development economics today is about details, and in a sense, I think that was very clear in Abhhijit's presentation. We go about trying to, no, I say we, is really like a group of people, go about trying to understand the details of a situation. It takes very many projects, one after the other, and then we try to come to some understanding how to fix a little something. Of course, a little something might be important when it's education, but at the end of the day, in a sense, there's some commonality maybe with engineering, which is it's like, can we, do we understand the machine, and can we fix it in this way and that way to make it work better? In that sense, the title, The Engine of Development, we are more about like the artisans that Joel was talking about than the great inventors that came before. And in a sense, you're thinking, well, that's nice, you know, some people need to do that, but maybe we are leaving behind what is really important. Because when you look at the big world event, they often seem to have more to do with politics than with policies. To some extent, it's when we look about the developing countries, part of it seems to be determined by what's happening in the West. For example, if you're interested in aid and you're wondering, well, what's the effect of aid? Well, the key fact about aid is that most of aid is given to Egypt. If you had taken all the aid that was given to Egypt every year and given it to Sub-Saharan Africa instead, that would be $20 per African child under 5. That's quite a bit of money. It's enough for immunization, a bed net, some fertilizer for the parents, something to pay for teacher with a spare change. So, and clearly the aid given to Egypt had nothing to do with developing Egypt as a country. It was all about politics, somewhat failed politics to a point. And then there is also politics in the developing countries themselves. For example, you might wonder, you know, we've done a lot of work on immunization. We know how to improve immunization rates by tinkering with incentive in the right way. And you think, well, how good would that do to Côte d'Ivoire today to know how to do that? They don't have a government. They are coming out of a civil war. like they wouldn't really do that. So what's important is trying to figure out how to avoid maybe civil war in Côte d'Ivoire. So since Bill couldn't come, I thought that I would channel him. That's kind of one of the criticism he's had for our work, which is generally somewhat sympathetic to, but with one big caveat, this is a big caveat. RCTs, that's randomized controlled trials, are infeasible for many of the big questions in development, like the economy-wide institution of our good macroeconomic policies. And then he concludes, embracing randomized controlled trials has led development researchers to lower their ambition. So what I want to do today is to kind of, I guess, offer a defense and apology for this way of doing things, for our way of doing things, without taking anything from the fact that understanding the political economy at a very broad level is important. So the view that I just said is, in a sense, the main question of development, figure out how to sort out the political process. And then saying that to a large extent, the policies will follow from the politics. So without politics, you can't really have good policies. And with good politics, the good policies would somehow follow. So for example, that's Darren and Jim's work, all their different papers insist, and their forthcoming book insist on the role of institutions, like property rights, the political system, etc., and show how they are the main driver of the success of a country. And they also make the point, which is important, that they are hard to change. You sort of, there is, they call it the iron law of oligarchy, or you could also call it, or there is a long shadow of history. That was very clear in today's talk, various examples in Darren's talk just now, that places which have had labor coercion long time ago still today have worse political systems and worse performance than others. You could see that, for example, in Melissa Dell's paper. Abhhijit and Lakshmi Iyer have a paper showing also the consequences of the type of taxation that the British happened to prefer at the time that they colonized your district, that still has an impact in collective action, investments, etc. today. So if that's the case, then in a sense you can be a little bit depressed. And that's kind of how I read at least the version of the conclusion of Darren and Jim's book that I read, which is, well, what you need is a revolution. That came today, actually. That's kind of the way that coercion stops. You need a revolution. So the French Revolution, the British Glorious Revolution are good examples. Maybe you have one today. So it's not that revolution never happened. So it's not necessarily very depressing, because once in a while there is a revolution. But this type of change through the revolution can't really be predicted, let alone it can be engineered. So maybe you can do a little something. So there is some recommendation that Darren and Jim make in the book about maybe you can do something with the media. What happens in Egypt today suggests that that's probably a good idea. But it's kind of hard. Basically, you don't really know. It's kind of shifting from one thing to the other. And so, see, they're already depressed. So, and it's sort of like, so the question is, if institutional change cannot be imposed wholesale from the outside or even from the inside, if you can't really do much about it, and if it's not guaranteed to happen on its own, then can anything be done about changing the lives of the poor people today? Or are we mostly stuck? So at some level, institutions, we know that, like, clearly matter. This was clear in the talk today, that they find a broad constraint. So I'm not going to question that at all. But the question I want to ask, partly because that's kind of my day-to-day life maybe, is to what extent there is slack. And I see two places where there may be slack. Because I'm French, I'm going to go in three parts. One, I'm going to ask, to what extent is there slack within the political game itself? To what extent is it kind of locked? To what extent are there things that can be done at the margin? The second is, to what extent, even if we take the political game as it is, there is slack in improving the policies within a given institutional environment? And the third is it possible to reverse the relationship and say, well, yes, true, politics will to some extent determine policies. are there also instances where policies will improve, where good policies will lead to good politics? And that's very important, because if that's the case, then that means that you can start working on the policies, hoping that the politics will somehow, fix itself or doesn't fix itself. But if there is some chances that the politics follow the policies to a point, then you have maybe a chance of kind of starting with something. So let me start with the first point. Is there a possibility of political changes at the margin? So I'm going to do this in two, every time I'm going to say, well, let's take bad institutions. Are they just bad institutions, or is there any progress possible even within generally pretty bad institutions? And then, so I'm going to do that for politics and then for policies. And then same thing for good institutions. Are they just good institutions, so everything is great, or is there progress there? So starting with political changes within generally broad, bad institutions. So as I said, one rarely see wholesale institutional change, although we are maybe in the middle of one. But incremental change do happen at the margin, even without major changes in the environment. In fact, a recent example is Yemen, which had some measure of democratization happening some years ago. And other example in history at various times had measure of democracy introduced in otherwise autocratic regimes. So the question is whether those are just for show and they really don't make any difference. And there is a nice paper for China by Mónica Martínez-Bravo, Nancy Chen, J.R. Padro and Miguel, who study the introduction of village-level election in China. Those are very, very imperfect elections. The first set of elections, the list of candidates was given from above by the party. The ballots were stuffed, etc. So it was like the very bad election, as you would expect in a country that is generally a pretty autocratic country. And yet, these elections were introduced progressively. So you can follow the effect over the type of policies that were undertaken by the local government. So comparing places that have already introduced the election to places that will do it some years later. And what you find is that the elected village chief, however imperfectly elected they were, take different type of policies. In particular, they're more likely to relax impopular central policies such as the one-child policies. And they also reallocate. In China, there is periodic reallocation of farmland in Chinese villages. They become more likely to benefit the middle-class farmer, who would be like the median voter, after the introduction of the election than before. So all of this goes to say that even this very imperfect election made the village chief more responsible to the people that they represent. So the same kind of case, which is there is sometimes changes at the margin within otherwise pretty autocratic, within otherwise pretty bad environment, can be made for corruption. So Indonesia is one of the world's most corrupt country, even today. And Banerjee looked at the effect of different ways to try to fight corruption on very local projects. And one of the things he looked at, so first there is a lot of theft on these very local road projects. These are road construction. It's 27 cents on the dollar is being stolen in the form of stolen material or stolen wages or things like that. And one of the interventions that he tried, and I remember talking to him, he was a graduate student, talking to him before he did the project. He didn't believe in intervention, but he wanted to test it anyway. He was more interested in the other one that I'm not going to talk about. He didn't believe in intervention because it was an audit intervention, and the auditors were going to be the same corrupt auditors that the same teams of corrupt auditors that are government auditors. So he felt like, who is going to monitor the monitors? That's probably not going to make a difference. And it turned out that despite the fact that he used those teams, which is, I think, what make the project very interesting, the corruption reduced from 27 cents on the dollar to 18 cents on the dollar on places that were randomly selected to get these audits compared to other places that didn't get the audits. So nothing changed about the general corrupt environment of Indonesia that remains something like 177 on the list of corrupt countries, and yet this kind of, however imperfect, you see a change in corruption here. But of course, perhaps more importantly, even good institutions, in capital letters, democracy, even proper democracy, are not necessarily a guarantee for good functioning of the institution in small letters. If you define institution, the day-to-day functioning of the operations. So for example, what is democracy at the end? It's a bunch of people voting. So once you've said that, you've not said all that much, because you need to say who can vote, you need to say who can be a candidate, you need to say how the votes are counted, you need to say whether it's like first past the poll or proportional and all that. And all of these things, of course, make a difference. And one of the things that makes a difference is how people vote, the very physicality of how people vote. You people who were in the US at the time will remember the famous butterfly ballot. In a sense, that's a clear sign that the very way that it's organized, how people vote, has a consequences for the expression of the people, which might actually have been quite relevant for world history. So an example, in some sense, of a similar type is a very nice paper by Thomas Fujiwara, who is a grad student at UBC going to Princeton, looking at what happened in Brazil. So Brazil is a very, in some sense, an example of like one of very large, well-functioning proper democracy. One consequences of being a very large functioning proper democracy is that there are a lot of candidates. So the problem with having a lot of candidates is it becomes a bit complicated to vote. So if you wanted to vote in Brazil prior to the reform that Thomas looked at, you had to fill up something like that. So that's a butterfly ballot too. There are two sides. You can vote for your prefeito or you can vote for your vereador. So if you vote for your prefeito, it's okay. You just need to tick some guy's name. If you want to vote for your vereador, you have to refer to another list of names because there are so many people that it's too long to fit on a ballot. And then you have to find a number of that guy, write it down here without mistake. And if there is a mistake, your vote is invalid. So of course the problem is because not everybody in Brazil is functionally literate, that becomes a little bit difficult for people to vote. And as a result, a fairly large fraction of the votes were actually invalid. I'm going to show you the number in a moment. So at some point, Brazil changed their voting system. My understanding from the paper is that they changed it because they wanted a faster system to count votes. They were not particularly aware of this problem or really interested in fixing it, but they wanted to count the vote faster. So they introduced this very nice little machine, which is an electronic voting machine. So you type down the number of who you want to vote. The face of the person appears here. If it's really your guy, you validate. If it's not your guy, you don't validate. So the chance to make a mistake is much, much lower. So when you do that, so this Brazil did that very nicely for the purpose of evaluating the effect, which is they first introduced it in large cities, with more than 40,000 voters, and then they introduced it into the smaller cities. So these were the fraction of valid votes in the election, in the 1994 election. And so you see that there is about from 65 to 70% of valid vote. Then in 1998, the system is introduced in the large city, and you see for the cities that are large enough, a big jump in the number of valid votes. So that's about, like 15% more votes become valid in the larger city. And then in 1998, even the small city gets introduced, so everybody gets together. So it's pretty clear sign that something happened in terms of counting the valid votes. Now, of course, these valid votes, who are they coming from? They're coming from the less educated, poor people. So who are these people voting for? They are voting for less educated, poor people, people who represent their interest. And what is really striking is that it is basically re-enfranchising these guys. The consequence of re-enfranchising these guys is that changes who they vote for and the policies that are being implemented. So people started spending more money on healthcare And as a result, there was actually an improvement in the health status of newborn. So in a sense, you have a technical fix here. It's like, you would think it's really not much. It's like total plumbing, which actually does lead to pretty significant changes in the lives of a large number of people. The second thing that, on the subject of voting is a question that is very, very important for thinking about political economic development is ethnic voting. In a sense, you would think, well, one reason why democracy is not enough is that, well, you could have democracy, but if people continue to vote for people from their own ethnic group, then these people are not really responsible, are not really accountable, and their policies are therefore they're going to be corrupt, etc. So Leonard Wanchiken has two very interesting experiments in Benin which illustrate two facets of ethnic voting. I'm going to talk about one first and one at the end, so you have to keep the one first in your mind. I'll remind you if you've forgotten by the end. So the first experiment, it's a very simple one, shows how an ethnically biased discourse helps you win against a generally minded public discourse. So what he did is that he happened to be, when he was in his previous life, he's from Benin, he happened to be a political opponent before the transition of Benin to democracy. So he knows everybody in politics in Benin. Benin is now a quite well-functioning democracy. And so before the presidential election, he went and met them and got a number of candidates to agree to run a little experiment where in places that were generally strongholds, they would change the message that they would convey in the political meetings. So they would either have this like very clienteling message that you have here on the board. We are the representative of Sakalafia, who is running to president. He's the only Bariba candidate. He is running because the region is very underdeveloped. If elected, he will help promote the interest of the region by building new school, hospital, roads, and more importantly, hiring more Bariba people in the public administration. So that's really like a call to pure-based clientelism. And then in some other villages, they went with the following message. We, as representative of the same bloc, Saka is running against the opposition in the north. If elected, he will engage in a nationwide reform of education and healthcare system with emphasis on building new schools, etc. In conjunction with other opposition leaders, we will fight corruption, promote peace between all ethnic groups of all the regions in Benin. So his question was which discourse is more acceptable, and what he finds is that people give almost 80% of their votes to the clientelist message and almost 60% to the public policy message. Remember, this was done in strongholds. So that's a bit depressing. On the other hand, it is possible that no one really trusted the public policy message. If they're used to something totally different, they must have felt that these guys were just joking or something. So the question becomes, if there is this clientelism, is it for very deep reason? Is it that it corresponds to people's very strong beliefs about how things should be run? Or is it because they don't really know any better? And one way to figure this out is to go around and tell them, hey, you know what, you don't have to vote for your caste, for someone from your caste or your ethnic group. And that's what Abhhijit and a set of his colleagues just did. So they went and worked with an NGO and literally gave this message, don't vote on caste, vote on issues, which is not very information-rich content, message, just telling them that. And yet the ethnic voting went down from 25% to 18%. So what that means is that whatever people do, they don't do it for very strong reasons. Otherwise, they wouldn't be convinced by a puppet show, even though there was a very good one, to change and vote on issues. So maybe what the problem is that they have no information of what the candidates do. They have no idea. So in that sense, you might as well go for someone who is familiar to you if you have nothing else to go by. So one way to test that, again, another experiment that Abhhijit was involved with, is to inform people. So in India, there is something called right to information, which you can use to obtain information about what the candidate did in your circumscription, starting with whether he has criminal record, finishing with whether or not he attended the parliament or not. And so this was printed in an NGO obtained the information, printed it in a newspaper, and the intervention was to distribute these newspapers and discuss it with the people a little bit. And what they found is that, they did it in different voting booths for the same politician, so you can compare what happened to a corrupt politician in a place where information about him is there to information about him is less available. And they found a large effect of corrupt politicians get fewer votes, competent politicians get more votes. So people seem to be very sensitive to information. And this is something that is done on a pretty regular basis in Brazil again. In Brazil, every month, they run a lottery like this. This is not the lotto. This is a lottery that they use to select 60 municipalities every month for auditing. So Fred Finan and Claudio Ferraz looked at what happens when your municipality is audited just before the election or just after the election. So if you're audited just before the election, the information about you is available. If you're audited just after the election, it's not available by the time of the election. And what they found is this, which is that the red places are the places that got audited just before the election. And there, if you have 0, and the blue places are the places that got audited just after the election. So the election probability, re-election probability of the incumbent is not affected by an audit that takes place later, which suggests that people are not aware of what is revealed in the audit so much because they're not responding to corruption that they are not told about. But once the municipality got audited, the information was shared in the media and was available quite widely. And there you see voters responding. You see that people who have 0 corrupt violation are more likely to be re-elected than people who've not been audited. And the re-election probability goes down with each violation that is noticed in the report. So that suggests that people are sensitive to information. I mean, because there are not very many. That becomes noise. So I think that's not a very big number of places. So that's kind of what's my first, sort of conclude my first point, which is that take a given set of institutions, democracy or not democracy, autocracy, there are actually many ways to actually go from, politics doesn't happen miraculously with the how do you call it, the invisible hand. It happened through a series of steps. And these steps can be more informative or less informative, more effective or less effective, and they matter enormously. So in a sense, we can think about politics in the same way that we can think about schools in a way, which is how to have rules that make them effective rather than ineffective. Second point I want to make is that so that's the first dimension of Slack, is to say, well, how can you at least improve politics a little bit within the general broad institutional framework? Second thing you might wonder is whether you can change the policies you can improve the policies within the broad institutional framework, or whether the policies are more or less determined by the institutional framework. That's, of course, very important, that kind of subtext of everything we do, that there is a chance to, if something works better, there is a chance it would be adopted and improve things. So there again, you can do the argument both ways, which is sometimes there are reasonably good policies undertaken, even in pretty bad political environments. So the school construction program that Abhhijit talked about, that I studied in my thesis, was one, in a sense. This was Suharto's Indonesia, which was not a very nice place at all. But more importantly, that's what I want to insist on, there are plenty of bad policies within generally benign political environment. And in that case, when the environment is generally benign, then you would think that perhaps the problems are not due to a big conspiracy against the poor or conspiracy from the political elites, and more from general incompetence or lackadaisical or something like that, in which case there is something that you might do. And I'll give just one example very quickly, which is monitoring nurses, which is probably one of the biggest failure of a program that Abhhijit and I had the pleasure to be involved with. So this is a program that we undertook the evolution of the program. We also had a hand in the design, to be fully honest. That was mainly a collaboration between a district administration and Seva Mandir, which is an NGO in India. They started from a situation where there was huge absenteeism in the local, of the nurses in the local health center. And so the district decided that they had to do something about it. And they commissioned Seva Mandir with implementing a monitoring program. So Seva Mandir distributed a date and time stamp to nurses and asked them to stamp several times a day to show that they were there, 1 day a week. It was not the most ambitious program in the planet. It was to show that they would have to be in their center 1 day a week. And then what we did is that we went behind and checked both in a place, some places, 33 centers were randomly selected to have the program, and another 30 were kept as a control group. And we looked at the effect. And if you focus on the dotted line, these are what happens on Monday, which is the times where you were supposed to have the program in place. And at the beginning, it was all great. The treatment center really improved their presence compared to the control center. They're much higher, the blue than the red. But after about 6 months, the blue started going down, while the red was actually going up. So that by the end, they are the same, or in fact, the presence is a little higher in the control group than in the treatment group. So clearly, that was not a very successful program. So what happened? What happened is that this is what happened. What happened is that this is the register, this is data from the register that the nurses were maintaining. And so they were either stamping to say that they were present, or they were absent, or they were writing down that they had an excuse. Now, and what happens, the red here is the excuse, the blue is present, and the white is absent. And you can see over time the blue going down, and the red going up. And the red are the excuses, two kind of excuses. One is machine problem, so that's them kind of not being very gentle with our machines. And the other is, and actually that is responsible for more of the increase, is this exempt category. What's the exempt category? It's a supervisor of the nurse writing them as they were having a meeting or something. Well, we can check whether there was meetings, and we know there was no meetings, so we know that this is like pure collusion between the supervisors of the nurse and the nurses. So why did this policy fail? So on one hand, you can say, well, maybe this is an example of political economy going in a way of like a technical fix. That's kind of almost why I picked this example, which is at some level it's true. In particular, one thing that didn't happen is people didn't complain. People didn't go see there. This is a system that was implemented by the government and that was undermined from within, and no one did anything, even though they saw that it was clearly not working. And one of the reasons why they didn't do anything is nobody complained. And one of the reasons why nobody complained is they couldn't care less, the people, about the health center. The reason why they couldn't care less about the health center is that they've long given up on it, because it's a system that is mainly broken. So it is so the reason why it is broken is in part because it was not conceived very well at all to start with. It's a system which, like the health system in many developing countries, is constructed by someone who lives in La La Land. So people, the nurses are supposed to go to the village, and then are supposed to go from the village to every single little village in their places, and then come back to the center, and then take the bus and go back to the village. And this is a job that no one can do that is human. So what they have decided, since they couldn't really comply with the rule, is that they were going to take the rules in their own hands, that they find their own rules, and their own rules didn't really involve having to come to work. So when we first introduced the system, we said, well, you were going to come from 9 to 4. They said, no, we cannot possibly come before 10. And even though the rules on the wall that is painted here says 8 o'clock. And one of the issues is that this is, in a sense, a program that is not fixable, because it was never conceived to work. It was conceived with rules that are for ideal nurses and for ideal people who will be all excited to get information about ORS and immunization, where in fact neither the nurses nor the people are ideal. And therefore here, the fix couldn't work. So what is needed here, and what would be needed here to fix the system, is to do something like we did with the schools, which we haven't fully done in the case of the health system, is to say, well, how do you really make the system work? Like what would be a way to organize the primary healthcare system in a way that people would actually respond to it, and that the people who are in charge of actually performing these activities would be excited about it. So let me finish with my last part, which is, can we go, in some sense, beyond political economy? Can we reverse the hierarchy that I started with, which is politics come first, policies follow, and say, is it possible that policies have feedback effects on politics? And I want to take two examples of cases where I think this is happening. This has happened. One is work that I have done in India about the panchayat system, which shows evidence that voters adjust their view. Even voters that start pretty prejudiced, are able to change their views and preferences in who they vote for on the basis of what they see happening in the field. So India has a system of quota for a woman leader at the panchayat level. The panchayat level is the lowest level of decision making in India. So the panchayat are local village councils that are in charge of administering local public goods. They were invigorated in 1993, and at the same time, there was a quota passed said that every election, 1/3 of the panchayat are selected randomly, and they have to elect a woman. They can elect anybody as long as it's a woman. So the question so one could ask many questions about this system, and I've done that over the years. One first question is whether women are decent politicians, and they are decent politicians. They are pretty much as good as men, maybe a little better. They are less likely to take bribes, for example, although they represent the interest of women more than the interest of men compared to men, and men represent closer the interest of men. That makes sense. So the next question, which is the question that I want to spend more time here, is whether if you're a voter and you start from a rather prejudiced position that women are incompetent politicians, and you see a woman and she's fine, do you change your mind about voters, about women as leaders? And if you do, then it would be kind of a first little point in my column that policies can change politics, because that would affect political preferences, who people vote for, and therefore outcomes at the end of the day. So the problem is it's very difficult to ask people what they think of women politicians, partly because if you ask them, they are going to tell you what they think you should hear. And in these cases, we hate them because they want to get rid of the quota system. So what we did is we asked women and men actors to tape a speech that was pronounced by one of these leaders. So it's a speech that they gave, and we had a series of men and women give the speech on a tape, and then we go to people and we randomly select you to listen either the male speech, say Roberto listens to the male speech, and Jean-Charles listens to the female speech. And all they know is that there is this speech. And then I'm asking them a series of questions about what they think of the person who was pronounced, of the politician who gave this speech. And because they have no other differences in the speech other than the voice, if people rank them differently, that's a sign that they statistically discriminate against whoever. And so the first thing is that if you focus on the places that were never reserved, these are the blue lines. These are the response by men, and these are the response by women. And this is the difference between the average rating that is given to a male speech and to a female speech minus a male speech. And you see that the men give a discount, don't like women's speeches. So they give negative grade to women's speeches compared to men's speeches. Sorry, error, never reserved. They give negative grade to places that give women's speeches. Let me make sure that I have the thing right. And then, this is never reserved male and reserved. But then when they have had the experience of a female politician, then the difference actually reverses. So people who've never experimented with a female politician statistically discriminate against women. And as soon as they experimented with a woman politician, either in the past or today, they start statistically discriminating in favor of women, actually, which is a sign that their political opinion evolves. So you could say, well, does it really matter? Well, it should matter in that they should vote for, if it matters, do they vote more for women? And they do. This is the fraction of women pradhan, that is women village leader, in villages which are currently not reserved for a woman. So if you look at the blue bar, you see the places which, in places which have never been reserved for a woman, the chance for a woman to be elected on an unreserved seat is below 10%. Then it goes to 13% if they've been reserved once, and it increases further to 17% if they've been reserved twice. So all of this matters. It's not only what people think in their head, it also matters in terms of who they actually vote for. The second example of good policies potentially reverting, good policies potentially affecting. So why do I say that this is a sign that politics has improved? Well, because no matter what you think about women and men, if people start with a prejudice against half of the electorate, partly because they've never had any experience with them, then you feel that increasing their information set is a good thing. Particularly if it's going to change who they vote for, it means that they were not optimal before. Here's the last example that I want to talk about, which is back to Benin and Leonard 1 second experiment. You remember the first experiment, which was showing that people were more swayed by a very basic clientelistic message than by a public policy message. So in the next election, in the following election, he ran another experiment, which sheds additional light on this question. Sometimes before the election, a few months before the election, they ran an expert conference. So in a sense, this was the type of conference that some people might not like. It's like an expert conference with international experts giving advice about what Niger should do. The international expert was from the region, so not as bad as me coming, but something like people offering their views on what Niger should do. And then at the end, they had a series of propositions. So they had a panel on education and on democratization and something like that. And they had several policy platforms coming out of this conference. And after the conference, several parties volunteered to use the proposals at the conference as a platform for campaigning. So what they did is, again, they ran these same experiments where in some places they went with the usual campaigning, which is the kind of clientelism plus balloons. And in some places, they went with the policy that were developed in this conference. So quite specific suggestions for what to do with Benin. And then they had town hall meetings, so people could discuss them, and they could kind of exchange, and etc. And there what they find is that the experimental candidate, the guy who went with the policy platform, got 67% of the vote in the treatment villages versus 61% in the vote in the control villages. So here you go, if you keep in mind the fact that to start with, people are more likely to go for a clientelist message, and here you go for a public interest message, you actually get more votes, not less votes. And the big difference is that, in my view, the big difference is that the public interest message was not just an empty thing, say, trust me, I'm going to do good things, but was actually based on something where there was some real reflection behind and maybe some evidence and then some discussion. So people could actually believe that there were some real policies that were going to fall, which is why I think it's an example that sometimes if you start with good policies, that can actually create a virtuous circle of people starting to believe in politics as, in a good sense of the term, better. So to conclude, many people are somewhat, and policymakers are somewhat pessimistic about institutions in the developing world. You can blame your the culture, or you can blame colonization or agrarian institution, but generally saying, well, this is going to be kind of very heavy and hard to change. We're not that pessimistic, although it's clear that political constraints exist. They put all sorts of brakes on what can be done and how that hard to predict political events, like what's happening today in the Middle East, for example, have important political impacts. However, there is a lot of scope for better policies, perhaps particularly in regimes that may not be completely locked or at war, where, of course, the political economy dimension determines, simply because there are a lot of very bad policies for no particularly good reasons. And then sort of the good starting point is that if the policy improves, then voters actually take notes. And that might give incentives for politicians to actually deliver rather than not deliver, because after all, politicians want to be elected. So one example of this is that in Latin America, when the PRI lost power, the next president, Vicente Fox, kept the Progresa program of conditional cash transfer on, because it had been shown by this randomized experiment they had organized to be an effective program, and as a result was extremely popular. So it is the case that a careful understanding of motivation of everyone, the local policymakers, civil servants, etc., can lead to policy and institutions that are better designed and that are less likely to be, that you can make a little bit more robust to corruption, dereliction of duty. And thinking of this political economy is always very important, thinking how can this be distorted? But you can create systems and policies that are robust to this. And these changes are not going to amount to revolution, they are going to be incremental, but they may amount to like what we call quiet revolution, which is eventually things could improve tremendously, little step by step. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have time for a few questions. Philippe?
We had a very interesting debate, in fact, between the belief in the fact that you could have lock-in bad institutions, lead bad policy, and maintain the bad institutions, and somehow the merit of what you did is to say, well, maybe the situation is not so hopeless. You may not be as much in a lock-in as you think. You could get ways around. But you believe, you mentioned, you propose incremental change. So is the choice really believing in, on the one hand, institutional lock-in, or believing in incremental change? What about explaining macro change? For example, China and Deng Xiaoping, was it just an accident, or did it come from something that existed in China and turned into something more macro? How you explain India in the 90s? And I wonder if we are not going back. I mean, it's true, now mentioning Marx, he looks a bit, like old-fashioned. But, you read in Marx that when, the productive forces go in contradiction with what he called le rapport de production, you might get something going on. Now, of course, all this jargon is gone and all this we don't use. But there was this idea that sometimes, even in countries with bad institutions or obsolete institutions, you can have raising middle-class, educated forces that, at some moment push for a change in the system, either to evolve or a revolution like in Tunisia, which was really the skilled youth that pushed for it. And in a sense, isn't the challenge for all of us to try and explain also large-scale institutional and policy change, going back, but modernizing some of the insights of Marx, maybe? So, for example, what would be the new notion, the new way of looking at productive forces and how they trigger the thing? What is the role of competition? And that goes back to what Joel said. Is there, the fact that when you compete with other countries, even though you would not like to make the changes, you have to do them. Wars or competition pushes you to do things you will not do otherwise. And then I get to an idea that I believe that good policies may sometimes trigger good policies. For example, universities, Shanghai ranking got a lot of countries to improve the university system, even though there were, corruption and things, because the benchmarking teach you. So what are your views about how you could extend at a more macro level what you are saying at using micro experiment, and what do you think are the forces that could explain what you can get out on a more macro level from technology, from institutional lock-in? It's just a simple question.
Yeah. So yes, I would not like to find myself in Joel's situation and someone say I'm explaining some institutional change and someone arrive and say, how can you explain that? Go back a few decades and look at Chile and Venezuela, and why is Chile what it is today, and why is Venezuela what it is today? How can you explain whereas Venezuela looked so much promising from a political perspective several decades ago? It may be a bad example, but imagine it's a good one. Several decades ago, and now Chile is so much, it's kind of a real democracy. It has an alternance of power and all that. And I know I would like, I don't know. And so maybe in that sense, I think these are very important questions to think about. And I'm very glad that some people are thinking about them. Maybe this is where the lowering the ambition come in, which is, it's not, I personally don't feel extremely comfortable with them because I feel they are too hard for me. And that the data that we have is relatively limited. There is the history that we can, so we can get some very good theoretical insights from looking at the evolution and from looking at the history and then accumulating them together. And so in a sense, I think better theorists need to look at this thing than me. So I think that's a great thing to look at. I don't know if from the micro experiment it will accumulate to Tunisia. What you can, so in a sense, the ambition here is more, well, this is very important, and some people need to think about that. And on the other hand, even if we keep that as it is, and we are thinking, well, below this, in this, below that surface, what is there, and is what is there below the surface details, or is it not details? And my claim is that these are not details. That even if they don't, even if a revolution in Tunisia is something extremely important, all of the changes that happen in Tunisia in the meantime and makes Tunisia whatever it is today with its level of education and its labor market problems and all that are also very important to explain what is Tunisia today. And so I think there is scope for both things. I don't know the extent to which they can meet. I'm sure someone will come up with that. And it's more of a division of labor for looking at these two things. I don't think the micro will ever replace thinking about things from the macro, from the historical perspective.
Yes. Well, my question is actually, I'm thinking of the stability of these small reforms. Okay, and this comment comes from my experience of growing up in Latin America more than actually, thinking more about these things. But I was living through the 90s and seeing how many of these institutional changes were growing, and people of my generation actually do the thing you were telling me, like actually thinking that things like paying taxes and these kind of things were a good thing, and we followed that kind of strategy, and then eventually crisis in the beginning of the 2000s show us that that was a very bad strategy. So actually, kind of the thing I'm thinking all the time, and again, this is from experience of, I love the idea of incremental changes, but I see them as very unstable. And here, my way of rationalizing this is thinking, okay, demography is the thing that eventually you have to bring in, simply because eventually I always thought that if enough people of my generation would live through a period of stability, perhaps these kind of things never happens, okay? So kind of the thing I have all the time in my head is all these things, these incremental changes help to build institutions, but are very difficult to maintain them in the future if you have the country being affected by crisis with a certain frequency. So I don't know whether you have thought about this thing or whether you have a comment on this.
Well, if you take Brazil had like kind of cycles and.
I'm thinking about Argentina, which is my country, okay? So,
Yeah.
So I'm thinking of, 12 years of stability and suddenly crisis, and everyone is back to the 80s and the 70s, and thinking back in the same way they were thinking before, telling you, I told you so. Okay, you shouldn't have been putting money in the bank, you shouldn't have been paying the pension system, you shouldn't have been I mean, so it's not a critique. I love all these things, but I'm just thinking, okay, perhaps you have an idea that I haven't thought of.
I don't really know how to answer this question. In that it seems that it's more about it's kind of a little bit what Daron said yesterday in the macro discussion, which is it's very like when the macroeconomic crisis, they happen as a result of forces that we understand even less than, like because of all the interaction of all of the agents that we understand even less than what's happening in politics. Now, you take Brazil again. Like Brazil had this like cycle of like being like trying to be populist, spending a lot of money on populist measures, then going in hyperinflation and going into crisis, etc. And eventually, through this process of kind of little bit like a virtuous circle of policies and politics, kind of stabilize both economically and politically in a way that can show that these things somehow kind of get to work. And then you have a series of kind of good policies, Bolsa Escola, etc., and generally pro-poor intervention that kind of create a trust in the system that wasn't there before, that allowed them to take some measures reforming the economy and move from there. So now why that happened in Brazil and not in Argentina is precisely the thing that is.
Is that stability? That's the thing that you're pointing out. That's right. People trust in the system very well. Okay, in Brazil they are doing that right now. But how stable is that? I mean, let's say.
Yeah, no, that's a good. I don't know.
Let me try a similar question to force your view a little bit out. So my reading of the evidence is that these policy failures are highly correlated across policy dimensions. There are countries that fail on all dimensions. There are countries that do very well on all dimensions. And so this suggests that there is a common explanation behind these policy failures, and we ought to try and go about and understand that kind of explanation. Now, your approach is different. It's very welcome. Of course, there isn't just one approach that works well, but it looks at the individual policy failures, trying to remedy them. Now, is it because you dispute my premise that there are these high correlations along many policy dimensions? Is it because you think it's hopeless or very difficult to understand what would be the common explanation behind these policy failures? Or is it just because this is one way to go and there are many others in your... So I think I'd like to know your opinion on this.
A bit of both, I guess. On the one hand, I think there is a correlation. For sure, there is a correlation, but it can be overstated. And it's, I think, I don't know what correlation you have in your mind, but I'm sure it's much lower in mine. I think when you look at the details of things, in India, they are very good at running railway, and they are pathetic at running a healthcare system. So there is so many things that, and in Indonesia, they are quite good at running the healthcare system and not very good at not having corruption. There is enormous amount of differences actually across systems for reasons that are partly accidental, in that there are reasons that, sometimes there are problems that it seems no one just bothered to fix. And in that case, the question is, the charge is figure out what the problem is, take the trouble to try to understand and fix it and move forward. In other words, I do think that there is a fair amount of dollar bills on the ground that no one has bothered to look for. So I don't believe in the correlation. Let me finish. The second part is that I think that it is not hopeless, but it's very difficult to try to look for the common cause. One needs to do it. But in the meantime, one thing that can be done here and now is to try and fix the things individually. And so let me.
I guess the other point I think that's implicit in Esther's discussion is that you don't know whether that set of correlations, to the extent it exists, is because of underlying structural factors, or because it's just the traditional public administration is bad, people have tried to do things in a particular way, and that way generally doesn't work. And I don't know that the data is very clear on that. You could read a lot of the institutional failures as failures of some deep structural system where there are conflicts of interest, or people have some, or you could think of it as mostly being thoughtless design, which was not appropriate to the environment. I don't know which one is true. So that, and if it's the latter, then that has many implications for what you would try to do, which you wouldn't try in the first case.
It'd be hard to explain why it's all design of all many different dimensions.
Well, if you have a non-experimentalist, then people design.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out the connection between the Bill Easterly comment at the beginning and what the main contention here is. That is, he said RCT doesn't give you the answer to big questions about democracy and big changes and so forth. And the message here is, there seem to be a lot of messages, and I can't figure out which is the main one. One is a sort of follow-up on Joel's talk, which says whatever sort of system you have, there's got to be artisans around who actually know how to make the damn machine work. You don't need big theorists to tell you big, great stories. The people who have to actually do it, and that's what you're doing. Say that second arrow there on the board. Everything has to be analyzed carefully. Another part seems to be, well, you can be useful in terrible situations, because if you can get a little bit of progress, there are many areas in which there is progress to be made. What you just said, there are dollar bills lying on the floor. You didn't say $1 billion bills lying on the floor, you said dollar bills, and that seems to mean this is about small things that can be done to improve situations marginally, or is this about you have to do it through small things to make big changes? Question mark.
So I think there is a bit of a optical illusion that if you have a big question, you need a big answer. That that's quite pervasive, and that I think has the order of magnitude sometimes wrong. So it's not because you have a small solution that it is not that the effect of that are not big. And what we need to care about is the effect of that. My ambitions are large. But so you take the Brazil example. This is a very small solution to introduce this machine. Compared to, we are going to have some, going from autocracy to democracy, which, you would think it's a really marginal thing, the type of thing that, lower your ambition kind of comment. The effect of that, if it's to reduce, the effect of that is more, in terms of order of magnitude, there is maybe some evidence that democracy is related to low birth weight, although that it has, I'm not sure I entirely believe it, but the order of magnitude are not very different from that, if that's the case. So, and likewise, you take deworming. So it costs, it's like archetypical tiny solution, right? It costs $0.50 per child per year to treat them for their intestinal worms. Michael Kramer and Ted Miguel did an experiment many years ago. They looked at the effect on schooling, and then just recently they looked at the effect on wages. So it turns out that a kid who has been dewormed for 2 years instead of 1 makes 20% more. So for 2 years versus 1 more, you get 20% more, like all the time, every year. 20% more of, this is in Kenya, like what kind of macroeconomic policy have led the GDP or the wages to increase 20%? They've gone down. I'm talking Kenya. So it's like, it's not, the order of, the things are small, but the effects are not small. The effects, it's just the order of magnitude of the effects are perfectly respectable by the standard of what the big solution can deliver, and we can actually have a handle on them.
Thank you, Esther. Let's close the session here. So this brings us to a close, and the program says that the concluding remarks are by Carlo Favero, the IGIER's president. You want to add something?
So, as my good old friend Roberto said, when I started thinking about this final remark, I put down 3 lines, and I started off with 3 lines, and I ended up with 3 lines. So, line number 1 is well, the future of IGIER. I think that this conference is a good benchmark, because it tells us that the future of IGIER will probably be interdisciplinary. I think there is a lot to be said for research at the interface between political science, cognitive science, economics, finance, and demography, and this is where IGIER will move from now onwards. The second line is the spirit of IGIER. We're seeing a lot of enthusiasm for ideas and their policy implication and application during this conference. And this is the spirit of IGIER, and this is what we would like to convey to our students. And the last line, the third line, is Maristella and the speakers. They've all been very interdisciplinary. All of them have been very enthusiastic, and they all done a great job. So thank you very much.